I knew something was wrong the second my boots hit the gravel, and the air went quiet in that unnatural way that tells you people are watching before you even see them. The low hum of a two-way radio crackling somewhere to my left, the sharp scent of hot asphalt drifting from the street where a white HOA truck idled like it owned the place. And then a voice cut through it all, firm, rehearsed, like they'd practiced this moment in a mirror. "Sir, you need to step off this property immediately." And I actually laughed under my breath because the property they were pointing at, the land under my feet, the driveway I paid for, the boundary markers I personally verified down to the inch, was mine, every square foot of it, my name stamped on the deed sitting in a fireproof box 10 feet behind me. But they didn't care, not the two men in matching polo shirts with clipped badges hanging too proudly from their belts. Not the woman standing a few yards back with her arms folded and that tight smile that never reached her eyes. Linda Whitmore, HOA president, the kind of person who spoke in rules the way other people spoke in sentences, like reality itself needed her approval before it could exist. And as I took another step forward, I heard the crunch of gravel echo louder than it should have, like the ground itself was paying attention, like it knew something they didn't, because I'd seen this pattern before. Different uniforms, different titles, same mistake, people stepping into spaces they didn't understand, assuming authority where they had none, and I could feel the shift happening already, that moment where frustration turns into something colder, more precise, because the first thing they did wrong wasn't the accusation, it wasn't even the tone, it was the line they crossed without realizing it, right past the survey stake half hidden near the edge of the driveway, the one with the faded orange ribbon tied around it that most people would ignore, but I never did. And one of them planted his foot just beyond it, casual, careless, like it didn't matter, like boundaries were suggestions, and that's when I stopped arguing, stopped explaining, just let the silence stretch. Long enough for them to think they'd won something. Linda taking a step closer now, heels clicking against the concrete with that controlled confidence, the faint smell of expensive perfume cutting through the dust and engine fumes. "We've documented multiple violations," she said, holding up a clipboard like it carried weight, like paper could override ownership, and I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to keep talking, to keep building her case out loud where every word could hang in the air, recorded, remembered, useful. And somewhere in the background a neighbor's garage door creaked open, someone watching from a distance. Because people always watch when authority shows up, they just don't always realize when it's fake. And I reached into my pocket, not rushed, not defensive, just steady, feeling the smooth edge of my phone under my fingers as the radio crackled again, and one of the officers shifted closer, like proximity alone made him right. And that's when I knew exactly how this was going to end, not with shouting, not with threats, but with something far simpler, because they thought they were removing me from my own property, and they hadn't realized yet that they'd just stepped into a situation they legally had no way out of. My name is Daniel Carter, and 6 months ago, I bought this place for one reason that most people in this neighborhood would never understand. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that does not come with committees or matching mailboxes or someone measuring your grass with a ruler. Just 3 acres of land on the edge of a subdivision that kept trying to pretend it was something more important than it really was. I paid cash, full market value, and I made sure of one detail that my realtor kept. Calling unnecessary. The parcel was never annexed into the homeowners association, not partially, not conditionally, not buried in some fine print, completely outside their jurisdiction, which meant no dues, no rules, no authority, just my land and the law. And I checked it 3 different ways before I signed anything: county records, survey maps, and a quiet call to someone who owed me a favor, because I do not make purchases like this without understanding exactly where the lines are drawn, and more importantly, who has the right to cross them. The morning I moved in, I walked the entire perimeter myself, boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt near the tree line, fingers brushing against the old wooden stakes left behind by the survey crew, each one marked with coordinates that matched perfectly with what I had already seen on paper. And I remember thinking how clean it all was, how simple. A boundary is a boundary. It does not care about opinions or neighborhood meetings or someone's idea of what looks better on a brochure. And for a while that simplicity held, until Linda Whitmore decided it did not apply to her. The first notice showed up 2 weeks after I moved in. A thin envelope tucked under my mailbox flag like it belonged there. printed on official-looking letterhead, citing violations that did not make sense because they could not legally exist, things like unapproved driveway usage and non-compliant landscaping. I read it once, then twice, then set it on the kitchen counter and let it sit there while the smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and the quiet hum of my refrigerator reminded me how peaceful things had been just days before. I did not respond right away because I wanted to see what they would do next. People like Linda always escalate when they think they are being ignored, and sure enough, the letters kept coming, thicker envelopes, stronger language, mentions of fines that had no legal weight but were written like they did, each one signed with that same tight signature at the bottom, neat, controlled, convinced of its own authority, and I started noticing patterns, dates that did not line up with actual inspections, references to bylaws that did not apply to my parcel, and the most important detail of all, every single document assumed I was part of something I had never agreed to join. That assumption right there was the crack in their entire case, the one thing they needed to be true and could never prove. And as I stood there now with gravel shifting under my boots and Linda watching me like she expected compliance instead of understanding, I realized this was not about a misunderstanding anymore. This was about control, about drawing lines where they did not exist and hoping no one would challenge them. And I have spent enough years dealing with situations exactly like this to know one thing for certain. When someone builds their authority on assumptions instead of facts, all it takes is one moment, one clear line, and the whole thing starts to come apart. The first time I met Linda Whitmore in person, she did not introduce herself. She corrected me, standing at the edge of my driveway with a clipboard tucked under her arm and sunglasses resting on her head like a badge of authority, pointing at a patch of gravel near my garage and telling me it was not up to community standard. Her voice smooth, but edged with something sharper underneath, like she was used to people backing down the moment she spoke. And I remember the heat that day, the sun, reflecting off her white SUV parked half in the street, engine still running, soft hum blending with the distant buzz of lawn equipment from somewhere deeper in the neighborhood. And I just stood there listening, letting her finish, because I wanted to understand exactly how far she thought her reach extended. She talked about compliance and harmony and maintaining property values like she was reading from a script she had memorized years ago. And when she finally paused, I told her one simple thing, that her association did not apply to my property, that I had confirmed it through the county. And for a second, there was a flicker in her expression, not confusion, not doubt, just irritation, like I had disrupted a routine she expected to go a certain way. And then it was gone, replaced by that same tight smile. She nodded slowly and said, "We will see about that." The kind of phrase that sounds casual but carries weight when it comes from someone who believes they can manufacture authority out of thin air. After that, the visits started, not daily at first, just frequent enough to make a point. Different representatives, same tone, always polite on the surface, always implying consequences just beneath it. They would stand near the edge of the property, sometimes just inside it, making notes, taking pictures, measuring things that had no business being measured. And each time I noticed the same detail repeating. They never acknowledged the boundary markers, never looked down, never checked their footing, like the physical line in the dirt did not matter because in their minds it did not exist. And that told me everything I needed to know about how they operated. They relied on perception, on the idea that if they acted like they had authority long enough, people would accept it without question. And for most of the neighborhood, that probably worked. But I am not most people. I started documenting everything, timestamps, angles, distances, the exact placement of every step they took onto my land. Not out of paranoia, but out of habit, because details matter when you are dealing with claims that hinge on technicalities. And one afternoon I noticed something else, a small metal sign near the entrance road that I had overlooked before, partially obscured by overgrown bushes. It marked the official boundary of the Homeowners Association jurisdiction, installed by the county years ago, faded but still legible, and it sat a full 30 feet away from where Linda's people were standing when they issued their notices. 30 feet that made all the difference in the world, 30 feet that turned their authority into overreach. And as I looked from that sign back to the officers now standing on my driveway, voices firm, posture confident, I could almost see the invisible line they had crossed without realizing it. The same mistake repeated over and over until it became routine, and routines like that are easy to break when you know exactly where to apply pressure. I slipped my phone out just enough to feel its weight in my hand, not raising it yet, not making a scene, just preparing, because moments like this are not about reacting, they are about timing. And Linda was already stepping closer again, her heels clicking in that steady rhythm, ready to push just a little further, convinced that I would eventually give in. And that was the moment I decided I was done letting them define the situation on their terms. The moment shifted the second Linda lifted that clipboard a little higher, like it carried more authority than the ground beneath her feet, and one of the officers took another step forward, his shoe grinding against the gravel just past that orange-tide marker without even a glance down, his radio letting out a short burst of static that cut through the still air. And I could hear a screen door somewhere down the street slam shut as another neighbor decided this was something worth watching from a distance. Because scenes like this always draw quiet audiences, people who want to see how far authority will go when it thinks no one is going to push back. And Linda's voice sharpened just slightly as she spoke again, repeating the word compliance like it was the only language she knew, telling me I was obstructing a lawful enforcement action, that I needed to step aside so her officers could proceed. And I remember noticing the small details in that moment, the way her pen hovered over the paper without actually writing anything, the way the officer's badge caught the sunlight but had no real insignia beyond a generic emblem, the way none of them referenced a single statute or code that applied to my parcel, just broad statements, confident tone, and the assumption that I would accept it. And that was the exact point where everything slowed down for me. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. This was not enforcement. It was performance, and they were used to people treating it like the real thing. I shifted my weight slightly, letting my boots settle into the gravel, feeling the texture underfoot, grounding myself in something real, while everything they were presenting rested on nothing but assumption. And I raised my phone just enough for the lens to catch the scene without making a show of it. Not hidden, not aggressive, just present. Because documentation changes the temperature of a situation whether people admit it or not. One of the officers noticed first, his posture tightening just a fraction, his eyes flicking to the device, and then back to me. And Linda followed his gaze a half-second later, her smile faltering for the briefest moment, before she recovered it. And that told me more than anything else she had said so far. Because confidence built on authority does not react to observation. But confidence built on assumption does. She adjusted her stance, squared her shoulders, and doubled down, saying they had already issued multiple notices, that I was in violation, that continued refusal would result in escalating penalties. Her words stacking up like they carried weight, and I let her finish again, gave her the space to commit fully to the version of reality she was trying to enforce, because the more certain she sounded, the clearer the contrast would be when that certainty met something real. I glanced briefly toward the entrance road where that faded jurisdiction sign sat, 30 feet of legal difference between what she claimed and what actually existed, and then back at the line her officers had crossed without hesitation. And I realized they had just created something they could not undo. Every step, every word, every assumption layered on top of that initial mistake. And I felt that familiar calm settle in, the kind that comes when a situation stops being unpredictable and starts becoming inevitable. I did not raise my voice, did not argue. I just spoke clearly, steady, letting each word land without force but with precision, telling them they were standing on private property outside their jurisdiction, that they had no authority here, and that everything from this point forward was being documented. And for the first time since they arrived, there was a pause, not long, not dramatic, just enough for doubt to slip in around the edges of their confidence. And Linda tried to fill it immediately, stepping forward again, insisting they had every right. But it was already different now, because once a line is pointed out, it cannot be unseen, and they were all standing on the wrong side of it. The pause did not last long, but it was enough for the weight of what I said to settle into the space between us. Enough for the officer closest to me to shift his stance again, not forward this time, but slightly back like his body had already started to reconsider before his mind caught up. And Linda saw it too. I could tell by the way her jaw tightened just a fraction before she forced that same practiced smile back into place. Only now it looked thinner, stretched over something less certain. She adjusted her grip on the clipboard and stepped even closer like proximity could re-establish control, her heels clicking sharp against the concrete. And her voice came out firmer, louder, carrying just enough to reach the neighbors pretending not to watch. She said they had documentation, that they had authority granted by community bylaws, that refusal to comply would lead to immediate enforcement measures. And I let her say it all, every word, every claim, because each one mattered now. Each one added another layer to something she clearly did not realize she was building against herself. The faint breeze shifted across the driveway, carrying the dry smell of dust and cut grass. And somewhere behind me a wind chime tapped softly against metal, a quiet, steady rhythm that contrasted with the tension building in front of me. And I noticed how none of them referenced the county. None of them referenced jurisdiction, just internal rules, internal authority, like the world ended at the edge of their subdivision. And that was the mistake that made everything else possible. I tilted my phone slightly, making sure the frame caught all three of them clearly, their positions relative to the marker, the expressions on their faces, the exact distance from the boundary line. Not because I needed to prove anything to them in that moment, but because I understood where this was going, and once it got there, details would matter more than tone or intention ever could. One of the officers cleared his throat and said something about procedure, about giving me a final opportunity to comply before escalation, but his voice lacked the certainty it had earlier, like he was repeating something he had been told rather than something he fully believed. And Linda cut in before he could finish, her words sharper now, insisting they did not need permission to enforce community standards, that my refusal was creating a problem that would not go away. And that was when I finally responded again, not louder, not aggressive, just precise. I told her that community standards do not extend beyond community boundaries, that bylaws do not override county records, and that stepping onto private property without jurisdiction is not enforcement. It is a liability, and the words seemed to land differently. I saw it in the brief glance exchange between the two officers, a flicker of awareness passing between them like a signal they did not want to acknowledge out loud. And for the first time since they arrived, the radio at his shoulder went silent. No static, no background noise, just a gap where sound used to be. And gaps like that have a way of making people think. Linda tried to push through it, repeating that they were acting within their rights. But there was something missing now, something that had been there when she first stepped onto the driveway, that unshakable certainty. It was thinner, cracked at the edges, and I could feel the shift completing, not dramatic, not explosive, just a slow, steady turning of the situation towards something they were not prepared for. I slid my phone fully into view now, no longer subtle, letting it be seen for what it was, a record, a witness, and I spoke one more time, calm, direct, telling them that everything from this point forward would be handled through the proper channels, that their presence here was already documented, and that continuing would only make things worse for them. And for a moment no one moved. The gravel, the air, even the distant hum of that idling engine seemed to hold still, like the entire scene was waiting to see which version of reality would hold, the one they had been trying to impose, or the one grounded in something they could not override. And deep down, I already knew which one it was going to be. The stillness stretched just long enough to make the outcome obvious to anyone paying attention. And that is when I made the call, not dramatic, not rushed, just a simple tap on the screen as I stepped slightly to the side, giving them a clear view of what I was doing without saying a word about it. Because sometimes the most effective move is the one that does not need explanation. The line rang once, twice, and then connected. And I kept my voice even, steady, giving only the necessary details, location, situation, the fact that individuals were asserting authority outside of their jurisdiction and were currently on private property. Nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional, just facts delivered in the same tone you would use to report a measurement or a coordinate. And I could feel the shift immediately, not in the person on the other end of the line, but in the space around me. The officers exchanged another glance. Quicker this time, sharper, and Linda's posture changed again, her shoulders tightening as she tried to maintain the same level of control she had walked in with. But control built on assumption does not hold up well when it meets something structured, something official. She asked who I was calling, her voice edged with something that was not quite concern, but no longer pure confidence either. And I did not answer her directly. I just continued the conversation, confirming details, giving a clear description of where everyone was standing, making sure the boundary markers were mentioned, making sure the presence of documentation was noted, because details like that matter more than anything she had written on that clipboard. And when I ended the call, I did not move. I just let the silence return, thicker now, heavier, like the air itself had weight. The idling engine from their truck seemed louder than before, the faint ticking of cooling metal mixing with the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. And Linda tried to recover. She stepped forward again, insisting that calling outside parties would not change the situation, that they were still within their rights to enforce community standards. But the words did not land the same way anymore, not even to her own officers. I could see it in the way one of them shifted his footing again, this time deliberately looking down, noticing the marker he had ignored before, noticing exactly where he was standing. And that small act, that single glance downward, told me everything had already started to unravel, because once someone checks their position, they are no longer certain of it, and uncertainty spreads quickly when it has a foundation. Linda kept talking, filling the space with statements about authority and compliance, but it sounded more like she was convincing herself now, reinforcing something that no longer felt as solid as it had minutes earlier. And I stayed exactly where I was, not advancing, not retreating, just present, letting the situation move around me instead of reacting to it, because this was no longer about argument or persuasion. It was about process, about letting the right sequence of events play out once it had been set in motion. A faint breeze picked up again, rustling the leaves along the edge of the property line, and I glanced briefly toward the road, not because I expected anything immediate, but because I knew what comes next when you shift a situation from assumption to verification. And behind me, through the open garage, I could see the edge of the kitchen counter where those letters still sat, stacked neatly, each one another piece of a pattern that had led to this exact moment. And as I looked back at Linda and her officers standing there, no longer quite as certain as they had been when they arrived, I realized something simple and absolute. They had come here expecting resistance they could overpower with confidence. But what they found instead was something they could not argue with, something that does not raise its voice, does not need to, something that just waits for the right moment, and then lets everything fall into place. The sound reached us before the vehicle came into view, a low steady roll of tires against pavement that cut through the stillness like a signal everything was about to change, and I watched it happen in real time. The way both officers instinctively turned their heads toward the road, the way Linda hesitated for just a fraction of a second before forcing herself to stay facing me, like she could hold the moment together if she did not acknowledge what was coming. But moments like this do not wait for permission. They unfold exactly as they are supposed to, and the vehicle slowed as it approached the edge of the property, not rushing, not aggressive, just deliberate, controlled, the kind of movement that does not need to prove anything because it already operates within something real. And I could feel the shift complete the second it came to a stop, doors opening with that solid, unmistakable sound that carries authority without needing to announce it, footsteps on gravel again, but different this time, measured, grounded. And I noticed how the two officers in front of me adjusted immediately, their posture straightening in a way that was no longer performative but reactive, like they recognized something they had not expected to encounter here. Linda turned then, finally, her expression tightening as she took in the scene behind her, and for the first time since she stepped onto my driveway there was no smile, no script, just calculation, fast and uneasy, trying to figure out how to reframe what was happening into something she could still control. And that was the exact moment I spoke, not loud, not confrontational, just clear enough to anchor everything that followed. I said my name, Daniel Carter, and I stated plainly that I had requested verification of jurisdiction regarding unauthorized enforcement actions on private property. Nothing more, nothing less, and the words landed differently now, because they were no longer just statements. They were part of a process already in motion. One of the arriving officials stepped forward, calm, professional, asking a simple question about the nature of the complaint, and I answered the same way I had handled everything else, with facts, with details, with the exact placement of boundary markers and the timeline of events. And as I spoke, I could see the contrast forming, not dramatic, not explosive, just clear, one side built on assumption and repetition, the other on documentation and verifiable lines. And the officers who had come with Linda were no longer speaking, no longer asserting. They were listening now, watching, their earlier confidence replaced with something more cautious, more aware, Because situations like this do not collapse all at once. They unravel piece by piece, each detail pulling at the next until the entire structure loses its shape. Linda tried to step back in, tried to reassert her position, referencing community authority again, but it sounded different now. Thinner, disconnected from the reality forming around her, and the official simply asked a follow-up question about jurisdiction boundaries, not confrontational, just precise. And that was the point where everything hinged. Because there are only so many ways to answer a question like that when the facts are not on your side. And I watched her pause, just long enough for the truth to surface in the silence. Just long enough for everyone standing there to realize that what she had been presenting as certainty was never backed by anything solid. And I stayed exactly where I was, grounded on the same gravel, within the same lines I had known from the beginning, because this was never about pushing back harder. It was about letting the right moment expose everything that had been built on the wrong assumption. The silence after that question did not break the way Linda expected it to. It did not bend or shift to accommodate her authority. It just stayed there, steady and unmovable, like the boundary line she had ignored now standing in front of her in a form she could not talk her way around. And I watched as she tried to answer, her lips parting slightly before closing again, her eyes flicking briefly toward her officers as if searching for reinforcement that was no longer there, because they had already stepped back into observation mode, no longer leading, no longer asserting, just present, waiting to see how this resolved. And that was the moment everything tipped, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet realization spreading across the space. The official repeated the question, still calm, still precise, asking for the specific basis of jurisdiction over this parcel. And this time there was no immediate response, just the faint rustle of paper as Linda shifted the clipboard in her hands, the edges of those printed notices suddenly looking smaller, less authoritative than they had moments ago. And I could almost feel the weight of those 30 feet between the HOA boundary sign and where we stood, that invisible line now. Louder than anything being said, I stepped slightly to the side, giving a clearer view of the survey marker, the orange ribbon catching the light, a simple piece of plastic and wood that carried more legal weight than every document she held. And I spoke again, not to argue, not to interrupt, just to clarify, stating the parcel number, the county record designation, and the fact that it was explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction, each detail placed carefully, like coordinates on a map. And the official nodded once, acknowledging, then turned back to Linda and her officers, and the tone shifted just enough to signal that this was no longer a discussion. It was a determination. Questions about their authorization followed, about whether they had confirmed the boundary before initiating enforcement, about whether any county verification had been obtained, and each question landed with the same quiet weight, not aggressive, not accusatory, just factual, and with each one the space around us seemed to settle further into clarity. Linda tried to respond, referencing internal bylaws again, but the words did not connect to the question being asked. They just floated there, disconnected, and that disconnect was everything. Because authority that cannot answer the right question is not authority at all. It is assumption. An assumption does not hold up when it is measured against something verifiable. One of her officers finally spoke, his voice lower now, acknowledging that they had not confirmed the exact boundary location prior to entering the property, and that single admission carried more impact than anything else said so far. It was simple, honest, and it aligned with reality in a way the rest of their claims had not. And the official responded with the same calm precision, outlining what that meant, not in emotional terms, but in clear, procedural language, unauthorized presence, potential overreach, the need to cease any enforcement actions immediately, pending proper jurisdiction verification, and just like that the structure Linda had been relying on lost its foundation, not through confrontation but through clarity. The officers stepped back fully now, no longer positioned as enforcers, but as participants in something they had not fully understood when they arrived. And Linda stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in, the absence of her earlier certainty more visible than any reaction could have been. And I remained exactly where I had been from the start, on my property, within my boundary, watching as the situation resolved itself not through force or volume, but through something far more reliable, the simple undeniable alignment of fact and law. It did not end with raised voices or dramatic exits. It ended the way real authority always does, quietly, with decisions that do not need to be argued once they are made. The official stepped back after outlining the next steps, his tone unchanged, professional, stating that any further action from the association would require proper verification through the county, that no enforcement would continue on this parcel until that was established, and that what had already occurred would be documented for review. Nothing more, nothing less, just a clear line drawn where there had been none before, and I watched as the officers who had arrived with Linda adjusted fully into that reality, their posture no longer projecting control, but acknowledging it had shifted elsewhere. One of them nodded slightly, almost to himself, like he was replaying the last few minutes and seeing the exact moment things had gone off track. And then they stepped back, physically this time, crossing the same invisible line they had ignored earlier. Only now it was not invisible anymore. Now it carried weight, recognition, consequence. Linda stood still for a second longer, the clipboard still in her hands but no longer serving any purpose. The papers clipped to it fluttering slightly in the breeze like they were just paper again, stripped of the authority she had tried to give them. And when she finally moved, it was not forward, not assertive, just a controlled step back, her expression composed but different, the certainty gone, replaced with something more calculated, like she was already thinking about how to reposition, how to recover. But that part was no longer my concern, because the situation had already resolved itself in the only way that mattered, through clarity, through fact, through lines that do not move just because someone insists they should. The sound of doors closing echoed softly as the officials returned to their vehicle, the engine starting with a steady hum, and the tension that had filled the space just minutes earlier began to dissipate, not all at once, but gradually, like air releasing from something that had been held too tight. And I lowered my phone, not because it was no longer needed, but because its purpose had already been fulfilled. Everything that mattered had been captured, every step, every word, every assumption laid out against something real. And I took a slow breath, the familiar smell of dust and sun-warmed gravel settling back into something ordinary, something calm, the kind of quiet I had come here for in the first place. Linda and her officers moved toward their truck without another word, their earlier confidence replaced by a silence that said more than anything they could have added. And as they pulled away, I glanced once more at the marker near the edge of the driveway, that small piece of plastic and wood that had never changed, never shifted, even when everything around it tried to ignore it. And I realized that was the entire point. Boundaries do not need to announce themselves. They do not need to argue. They just exist, waiting for the moment someone decides to test them. And when that happens, the outcome is not determined by who speaks louder or stands closer. It is determined by what is actually there, what can be proven, what holds when everything else falls away. I turned back toward the house then, the same house that had been questioned, challenged, and ultimately reaffirmed in the span of a single morning. And as I stepped onto the porch, the quiet returned fully, uninterrupted, exactly the way it had been before anyone decided to cross a line they did not understand. Because in the end they thought they were enforcing something that gave them power, but what they walked into instead was something far more solid, something that does not raise its voice, does not need to, something that simply waits and then makes its point when the time is right. And by the time they realized it, the decision had already been made.